In concert with that, today's guest is Mr. Don Watkins. He is a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. His focus is on inequality, Social Security reform, the welfare state, and the moral foundations of capitalism. He has been interviewed on hundreds of radio and television programs and speaks and debates regularly at conferences and university campuses. And now he's reached the pinnacle of success. He's on Liberty Talk Radio. What do you know? Mr. Watkins is the host of a podcast on inequality and welfare state, the Debt Dialogue, which has featured guests such as George Will, Walter Williams, and Charles Murray. He's also co-author of a book, Free Market Revolution, How Ayn Rand's Ideas Can End Big Government. During our live broadcast, call in with your questions or comments, 646-652-4620. We'll put that number up. There it is on the banner. And if you do call in and want to ask a question or make a comment, you want to break in, please press the 1 button so we'll know that you want to participate, you're just not listening. And with that, we'll introduce our guest, Mr. Don Watkins. Don, welcome to Liberty Talk Radio.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great having you here. This subject is one of my favorites, by the way, inequality, because I think I have an understanding of when the judicial system says everyone is equal under the eyes of the law. I understand that. But when we have young people or political opponents on the street calling, or minorities calling for inequality, I have no idea what they're referring to. No one is stopping anyone from doing anything illegal or be whatever they want to be, with whom they want to be, and yet they speak for equality. And I go, where else can you do this? What do you want me to do? Do you want me to give you what I've achieved, give it to you, and now we're purportedly equal? I don't think so. I still achieved it, you didn't. I can't give that to you. What's your take on that?
I mean, I think there's some deliberate ambiguity in just speaking of equality and inequality, because different conceptions of equality conflict. And so you can't be for equality across the board. And one way to think about this is just, where did equality as a political value really come from? Well, it really came out of the Enlightenment. And at that time, of course, you had every political system had the rulers and the ruled. And the whole innovation of the Enlightenment was to question that and say, is there any basis for it? And their view particularly was that there's no inherent basis for some having political authority over others, that political authority had to come from the consent of the governed, and that what the proper political principle was then was political equality. No special privileges for some, and no special burdens or restrictions or limitations on others. And so it's political equality that really created the United States and is the basis for freedom. And of course, equality before the law is one version of that. But economic inequality, we are, and as John Locke, one of the central thinkers of the Enlightenment, pointed out, if you have political equality, you're going to have enormous economic inequality, because people are unequal in virtually every respect, including how productive they are, how much they save versus how much they spend, how ambitious they are, what kind of jobs. Even if everybody was equally hardworking, if you create a if you're Stephen King and you write a book that millions of people want to buy, you're going to make a lot more money than Don Watkins, who writes books that thousands of people want to buy. And so the only way to fight economic inequality then is precisely to throw aside political equality. It's to give some people special privileges, including handouts at other people's expense, and to put special burdens on other people to hold them down. And I mean, this is the flip side of redistribution. You can think of it as the progressive income tax.
Right.
And so the blending of them, though, is deliberate, I say, because how do you appeal to Americans who value freedom, who value success, and make them want to endorse an idea that's going to tear down the most successful people? Well, you package it in what they've been taught since day one is a good thing, equality. And so I think this whole debate needs to start exactly where you did, by being really clear about what are we talking about? Are we talking about the value of political equality, or are we talking about the value of economic equality?
Right. Well, excuse me, did they press 1? Okay. All right. We have someone on the line, but they didn't press the 1 button. I didn't know if they wanted to break in. Well, it seems that it's almost inconceivable to have true equality once the government gets its paws on that particular arena. Once they get involved, it seems that the government then decides what is equal and makes everything very unfair, unequal, but in the eyes of the person screaming for equality, right or wrong, they think they've won their case. And so the only way to achieve true equality is to get government out altogether and have a true free market system. Am I correct, or am I just Pollyanna at this point?
I mean, the way I think about it is that if you value, so I value political equality because I think that's what allows us to not minimize economic inequality, but it does allow us to maximize opportunity. And that is really, if you care about human life, it's opportunity that matters. It doesn't matter whether I'm better off or less well off than you are. Like, that has no impact on my life. But am I free to make for myself the best life I can? That's what I should be concerned about, and that's what I think most people are concerned about. And the conditions for that is that the government treats us all the same. That is, it protects our equal rights.
Right.
And anybody then who says, well, no, what I want is to equalize economically, that can only come at the expense of opportunity. The government has to take away opportunities for some people, and it has to give other people unearned, I was going to say benefits, but they're not even benefits, because really, in the big picture, we all gain from living in a free economy. And when you take that away, it really undermines our ability to live flourishing lives, even if we happen to get some particular handout or favor from the government.
When people speak about inequality, what are they referring to that is unequal, that needs to be corrected by government to make it equal? What are they referring to in that regard?
Well, I think it really depends. This is one of the ways in which I think a lot of this debate is that the inequality critics are unclear about all of the central concepts. So one thing that people equate economic inequality with is they equate it with poverty. And so it stands in their mind as inequality is increasing means the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. But inequality, literally taken, just means a gap. And it just means a difference. And a difference can grow even if everybody is getting existentially better off. So for instance, if the top 1% of earners, if their income triples, and then everybody below that, their income doubles, you have people who are massively better off in every objective terms, but inequality has grown. So we can't ever confuse inequality with poverty. Now, when we're talking about gaps, we can talk about gaps in different things. We can talk about, which is the kind of central issue in this debate, income inequality, and that is how much of your, let's say, annual income, what is the difference between those who make the most and those who make less or who even make the least. There's also a debate about wealth inequality, which is your net worth, and that is, how much wealth is held by how few people. And then but there's also things like consumption inequality, which is how much actual goods and services are people able to consume. Is Bill Gates able to consume 1 billion times more than the average American? Well, no, it turns out his phone is pretty much like the one you have. He flies in a little bit of a nicer seat and his house is a little bigger, but basically the style of life that he has is not that different from what most Americans enjoy. And then there's also a discussion of equality or inequality of opportunity. And that is a more complicated discussion that we can definitely go into, because in some conceptions, equality of opportunity is legitimate. If it in effect just means political equality, the government treats us all the same. But what it's often used to mean is that everybody has the same chances of success. And then they point out, well, some people's parents are richer than others, and some people get a better education. And I think that kind of trying to equalize those opportunities to give everyone the same chances of success, whatever that means, that's disastrous, because what it really means is giving the government dictatorial power to hold back some people and then to give unearned benefits to others.
But isn't the government the antithesis or the poster child for inequality? Look at the people that Donald Trump is now selecting for his cabinet. People from Goldman Sachs. I think he makes minimum wage, at least minimum wage. I mean, all of the if you are someone who has contributed to a campaign, there's a good chance your daughter may get a job as an intern in government. I mean, we're talking about high wealth individuals, contributors, totally unfair, unequal. It's not a level playing field at all, and the government plays it to the hilt. And at the same time, they come back to us and they preach inequality and that we should make things more equal. It's like, who's calling the kettle black here?
Yeah, I mean, there's something to that, but to me, that's kind of like a side issue in the whole thing. I mean, it's the real question is, what are the ideas that are going to guide government and government policy? And so long as we view economic equality as an ideal, then I think the government will be instituting wrong policies regardless of the income of the people who are running it. And if the government, if we hold economic opportunity and freedom as an ideal, then I think you get dramatically different outcomes, regardless of, I mean, you can think about the founders of the United States. These were the elites, if you will, of their time, and most of them were quite rich, although not all of them, and yet it did not lead to corruption or anything like that, because they had the right ideas, because they were concerned with implementing the principle of individual rights. And so what we should be focused on, I think, is primarily like, what are the ideas that should be guiding us and guiding policy? And then it's a separate question of, well, how are the personnel of government being selected?
My problem is still, I have no idea when we talk about inequality, what index we're talking about. There's got to be different equality index, monetary equality index and freedom of movement. I can't define them because I don't know what they are. So when we talk about inequality, first of all, what are we talking about? And secondly, once we define that, is the country more free to be equal today than it was 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago?
I mean, so the central thing that comes up in debates is the idea of income inequality. And so it's, what is your annual income? And there's different ways of measuring it. And so, for instance, if you know anything about Thomas Piketty and his book Capital in the 21st Century, which made a big deal about economic inequality, he looks at primarily tax data and says, based on our record of taxable income, how much more are the people in the top 1% earning versus people in the bottom 99% of earners. And but regardless of how you measure it, there's some debate, but there's general agreement that among the top 1% of earners, you've seen a growth in their incomes relative to people who end up in any given year in the bottom 99% of earners over roughly the last 30 to 40 years. And there's a debate about why that's happened.
Yeah, my question was to be why that happened, and I have my own prejudice on that.
That much there's agreement with.
Yeah, I have my prejudice on that as to why. And I won't spill the beans because I may display my ignorance, and I hate doing that. But why, in your opinion, is there more inequality today? Why are there more? I have a very good feel for that myself, but I may not be correct. They're more, the rich get richer, and the middle class is shrinking. In fact, I think when I saw some statistic that the United States actually ranks relatively low of all industrialized nations in the percent of population in the middle class. In fact, we're at the bottom tier right now. And I wish I had the statistic with me and I could read it to you, but I don't have it in front of me.
Well, it depends on what you mean. So, and this is why these discussions, one of the things that the inequality critics, a recurring theme of our book, and a recurring theme if you study these, is they're consistently unclear about exactly what they're claiming and the basis on which they're claiming it. So, for instance, you could hear, we have less people in the middle class and think, well, isn't that a disaster? But if you define the middle class in terms of an arbitrary, spectrum of incomes, and that's generally what they'll do, is we're going to define the middle class as between $30,000 and $50,000. I forget exactly what the numbers are. And they'll say, oh my gosh, the middle class in America is vanishing. There's fewer people in the middle class. Well, guess what? the the statistic, it's true, there's fewer people in that kind of defined sphere of what is for some reason considered middle class. But the reason is because more people are above that now. More people have become rich and they've moved out of the middle class. It's not because somehow America has, the most poor people. And to the extent that these international comparisons are always dangerous for reasons like this, because you really have to be clear on the definition. So when, for instance, you say that Americans have more poverty than, most other advanced nations, well, it makes a big difference between if you're defining poverty the way the World Bank does, which is people living on less than $1, I think it's 20 a day, yes. Or if you're making it in terms of relative poverty. Because then, if you have a country with a lot of economic inequality, almost by definition, you're going to have more people who are relatively poor. But so what? Are they better off objectively? That's the real question that you should be interested in if you're interested in human well-being rather than human envy.
Yeah. Well, in the United States, are the poor better off today than they were? And I know there's a lot of government programs because that skews everything, but are the poor better off today than they were 20, 30 years ago? Or are the poor suffering more now than they ever have before?
I mean, there's no question that on the whole, all Americans are better off, substantially better off, I think, than they were 20 or 30 years ago. And in the book, we go into some of the statistics, but I think it's helpful to just look at more kind of objective, common sense measures. And if you just think of technology alone and the fact that somebody who is, say, poor, and first of all, most people who are considered poor by the government have access today to the internet. And if you just think about that alone, right, what does that buy you in terms of a life? I mean, these are people who are subjected by the government monopoly on education to some of the worst schools in the country and worst schools in the advanced world. Well, thankfully, if you have access to the internet, then if you're a driven, motivated person, that gives you a massive ability to overcome that handicap, say by taking courses at Khan Academy or by, you can watch, I think all of Yale and some of the leading universities on earth. You can gain a really good education. It might not give you a diploma, but it'll give you the knowledge.
Absolutely.
And of course, you can get a diploma through computers. So if we look at measures like that, if we look at the proportion of poor people who own cars or more than one car, all of that has gone up. And I think we should be excited about that. We should be frustrated there's not more of it. And I think I don't want to paint too positive a picture, though, because one of the negative things that happened is that over the last 20 and 30 years, government, contrary to what the inequality critics say, has grown enormously in terms of its intervention. And this has often come most at the expense of the worst off in society, that they have borne the brunt of increased regulation, of the costs imposed by those regulations, of the costs imposed by the welfare state. And so I think there are real and increasing barriers to rising out of poverty, but it's only to the extent that the United States has gone in the direction that the inequality critics want us to go in, and not to the extent that we have any remaining freedom left.
Yeah. Well, when I think of inequality, I think of the biggest government program to try to equalize people's lifestyles and what they own is the housing crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009, where they gave loans to people who couldn't afford houses, but the government guaranteed these loans because they wanted people to be more equal. If you can own a house, so could I. And of course, all they did was indebt the people. People couldn't afford it. Houses went on the market. The whole real estate system collapsed. Was that not an attempt toward equality, giving sort of teaser loans out and such?
I don't think that in that case it was primarily motivated by that as much. I think there was some of that, and I think it's a similar kind of ideological view of the world that says, basically, we want to lift up people who are poor, and the way that you do that is through government favors and through government handouts. And I think the rise of a focus on inequality that is really come to dominate the left really since 2000, but in particular since 2008, 2009. And so the focus then was more on what you can think of as like altruistic helping the poor rather than the egalitarian smash the rich mentality, which is what I think we've seen become more dominant lately. But I think what is interesting or what is helpful is to think that if their whole focus is on, when they claim their whole focus is on we want to help people, and the only kind of help that they can think of is giving them unearned benefits that come at the expense of people who've earned achievements. Right. And if you think about what made this country a land of opportunity and what allowed us to basically end the existence of poverty in this country in terms of absolute poverty, it was not handouts and favors from government. On the contrary, it was the fact that this was the freest country on earth. It wasn't that people were, had been swimming on rafts from Cuba because here they're going to go on the welfare state. It is precisely that here nobody was going to tell them what to do, and they would have the ability to rise by their own effort and ability. Yeah. And I think if you're really concerned with people's ability to flourish, and then the thing you have to realize is that the number one thing they need is get out of their way. Don't stop them. And so when you have things like occupational licensing laws that say, hey, if you want to braid hair, you better have a diploma and a government certificate that costs hundreds of dollars or even thousands of dollars.
Thousands here in Tulsa, it's unbelievable. They cost $27,000, by the way, here in Tulsa. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but that's how bad it is.
No, that's, yeah, and there's plenty of stories like that. And if you go to Institute for Justice's website, they just catalog the way in which you have occupational licensing, which inevitably come mostly at the expense of poor people who have skills, but not, a resume or a ton of money they can dump into starting businesses. And or take what's even more popular today, the minimum wage. In California, we've hiked our minimum wage over time to it'll be $15 an hour. And there's a debate about, well, how much unemployment will this cause? But you can't think about it in those terms. You have to think about it in individual terms, which is if I'm an individual and I cannot find somebody to pay me $15 an hour, the government's saying it's illegal for me to work. And so I don't care if that lifts wages for 99% of people. That is an injustice, and you can't justify an injustice by saying, well, look, it gives a bunch of benefits to a bunch of other people. No, you've obliterated opportunity for the people who can't find a job at $15 an hour. Right. And I find that really tragic, and it gives lie to the idea that the inequality critics are primarily motivated by helping those at the bottom. I think it indicates that their primary motivation is really tearing down those at the top.
Yeah, when I was young, very young, and I'm approaching 74 years old. My God, I never thought I'd live this long. But when I was a sophomore in high school, there was a camera store on the way home from school, and it was on Castle Hill Avenue. And I walked in, I said, I'd like a job. After school, the guy says, I'm not hiring anyone. And I said, well, I just want to work here. He said, I can't afford to pay you just to work here. I said, oh no, I don't want any pay, I just want to work here. And he said, what do you mean? I said, I always wanted to work in a camera shop. I love cameras, I love photography. I just want to work here. And I said, I don't want pay or anything. I just want to work here, help you out, and I just want to be around cameras and learn, And he said, guy's name was Bernie, never forget. He sort of hired me or let me do this, And I was with him for months, after school, and enjoyed it tremendously. But I'm sure today, if that was the case, everyone would be in jail, there would be fines and all that. We hurt no one. Everyone benefited by that, except for one time we were short in the cash register. I guess the gave guy wrong change. I remember that also. But that was giving me the opportunity to learn some business. Oh, I think we just lost you. What happened? You got him? I don't see him.
Well, can you still hear me?
Yeah. I don't see him, Hervey. There you go. Thank you. All right. I'm sorry. We just lost you for a second. And but I was speaking with the gal who was at the barbershop. My 5 strains of hair that are still left, and I asked her. But this was some time ago, and I said, "Well, geez, who taught you how to do this?" She said, well, I had to go to school. And I didn't know that. I said, oh, you had to go to school to do this? She said, oh, yeah, you have to be licensed. She said, you have to, she said, you can go to barber school, which is less expensive. I went to cosmetology school, and it was about a year or something like that. I said, what, just to cut hair? She said, well, you learn other things, how to dye hair, how to wash hair, and all that. I said, well, what takes so long? I mean, you think you can do that in a week, you know? She says, no, it's required that they take all these subjects and whatever. I said, how much did it cost? And it was $20-something thousand. And she had been working now for a couple of years, and she's still paying it off. And, you know, I don't understand this. I don't understand anything. In my days, if a barber would teach his son or his nephew or whatever, and they would come in the business and they would cut hair. Obviously, if someone cut my hair incorrectly, I probably wouldn't go back, you know, and that's the free market takes care of that. Why all this licensing and which makes things even more unequal, especially for people who are poor?
Well, I mean, you have to think about how this all emerged. It's that we view the government as having to control other people's choices in the name of the so-called public good. And one of the things that happens is that you get a bunch of pressure groups who basically say, hey, I'm the public, and so do what's good for me. And so once you accept the idea that the government gets to regulate anything that it declares, you know, it will make things better for society, then you're going to have things like the you know, haircutters lobby and the barber lobby saying, hey, you guys should really protect our industry from these upstarts who are undercutting us on prices. They should have to get licensed. And you see this in industry after industry, where a lot of what drives it are two things. It's driven by the industries who want protection from competition so that they can keep their prices higher. And then it's driven by an ideological appeal that basically says, if we have too much freedom, we're going to be overrun by rampant and destructive greed. And so the government has a right to clamp down on people's free choices, and that's really what's behind this trend towards increasing numbers of ways that people can go about making a life for themselves being put out of reach. And I think it's a really tragic trend, because it, you know, comes at the expense of that path out of poverty that really made it possible for so many people to rise into the middle class or higher 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Yep. Now basically the only thing you can do is go to college, and the problem with that is that the government has made that increasingly expensive, so that, you know, if you can get loans, you're going to be stuck with $60,000-$70,000 of student debt, which is not exactly an exciting prospect for somebody who is only has only ever made $5,000-$10,000 a year.
Yeah, I had a board operator that worked here recently, and he fills in once in a while, and he works for another radio station now. And his debt with his college, his credit card, his home, and his car is more debt in dollars than I've ever had in starting a business. And he admits, he says, I will die heavily in debt. And this is all programs to help the people, you know, further their careers or whatever. It's destroyed so many people. But let me ask you this. If today, when people are screaming about inequality, I mean, when political rallies or whatever, wherever they get together and they come to voice their opinion, what are the people referring to when they talk about inequality?
I mean, so one thing that it's important to highlight is that virtually very few of them are saying that we want to completely equalize people's incomes. What they do is they treat economic equality as an ideal. Like, morally, the more that we can go in that direction, the better, and the further away we go from it, the worse. But they'll allow, for practical reasons, some deviations from it. And indeed, the kind of intellectual godfather of today's egalitarian movement was a philosopher named John Rawls. And he was famous for saying that what we need to do in society is make it as equal as possible, but will allow for inequality when it helps the least worst off. So it's immoral, on Rawls's view, for Steve Jobs to make billions of dollars, but he should only make as much as, like, you know, some dishwasher who doesn't exert any effort and shows up late all the time. but we'll allow him to make more than the dishwasher insofar as it helps the dishwasher. And that's kind of their moral framework, is what they want to equalize to the extent possible while allowing some amount of economic inequality for so-called practical reasons. And that's why if you ask them, well, how much inequality is okay? How big is the gap allowed to be? They'll never give you an answer, a specific answer. It's always just more equal than it is today. And and that should be a real tip-off that they're not willing to state their principles openly. Yeah. The whole way that the inequality campaign works is that it tries to appeal to people who actually value success and value opportunity. And if they had to say, you're not allowed to make more than $1 million, that would quickly shut down their appeal to most Americans, because we quote a statement from what's his name, Bono, the singer from YouTube. The paraphrase is basically in the U.S. you look at a guy in a mansion and say, one day that could be me. In Ireland, we look at that guy in the mansion and say, one day I'm going to get that guy. And and it's that kind of what the inequality critics are really trying to do is take that sort of attitude of I'm going to get that guy, and try to make those policies appeal to people who actually have respect and admiration for success. And so what they try to do is say, well, the way that we're going to promote opportunity is to reduce economic inequality from where it is today. But you know what the funny thing is? If you go back in 30, 40 years to the point they today pretend was some golden age, the same people were complaining about inequality at that time. So for instance, you'll hear people outraged, oh, the average CEO is making 300 times his average worker, which is a bogus statistic, but set that aside. Well, guess what? They were complaining 30, 40 years ago when the average CEO was making 20 times the average worker.
Right.
And so what they really want is whatever economic inequality exists, they want less of it, which really means not that they want some end state of perfect equality, it's that they want to tear down the successful.
Yeah. Now, the government is the poster child of inequality. When you get a government job, you're less likely to ever get fired. You're guaranteed a pretty lucrative pension. You get all sorts of perks, days off, medical care. Everything is paid for. You don't get those same benefits in the regular marketplace. So the government, by virtue of hiring people, actually creates inequality.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of these examples where, like, if you were really consistently opposed to economic or any other form of inequality, well, wouldn't you be objecting to this? And the point is that they're really not. There's no such thing as being against inequality. There's no such motivation. Right. Like, if you see a blind child, you're upset because the kid can't see, not because a bunch of other people can. And the only reason that you would say, I'm against sight inequality, is if you wanted to go around and poke other people's eyes out. Right. And get away with it.
Yeah.
And so, like, yes, there's all these kind of contradictions in the ways in which people are being hypocrites. But what you really need to do is challenge them not for being hypocrites. It's not like I wish that they really did fight for, all these forms of equality. It's that I want them, and I want all of us, to reject as an ideal economic equality. The ideal should be political equality, so that we can each make the most of our lives and enjoy economic opportunity and economic progress. Yeah. And so we need a positive vision, rather than not simply point out that the people advocating this are not genuinely being consistent.
Yeah. So people are generally talking about economic inequality when they talk about inequality. I guess that's the main focus of it.
Yeah, although there's also debates that I think are important about racial equality and things like that. I think those are slightly different issues.
But those are economic.
There's a lot of debate over
aren't they rooted
equal pay for women and so on.
Yeah, but they're all rooted in economic foundations. It's all. I mean, if you look at whether it's racial or whatever, it all comes back to because they make more money. I'm Italian, I don't make as much as an Irish person, that type of thing. It all comes back to money as the root cause of or the purpose or the reason for inequality.
Yeah, but here's something really interesting to think about, which is that, the people talking about, gender equality and the pay gap between men and women, set aside whether that gap is real, which I think is questionable. But
I agree.
do I think that a man and woman who are genuinely equally able and productive should make the same amount of money? Yeah, but the economic inequality critics, the ones focused on economic inequality, what they say is that people who are differently productive should make the same amount of money.
Right.
What they say is that fairness is not that people who are equally productive make the same, it's that a Bill Gates should make the same as a Joe Schmo who barely exerts any effort, or close to the same. Yeah. And that, I think, is just on its face morally perverse. If that's your definition of fairness, something's wrong with your definition of fairness.
Right. Well, I've always felt that anytime the government gets involved and tries to make things fair, what they do is they give things to certain people, certain parties, and when they do so, they become an enabler. And when, just like parents, when parents enable their children, they don't let them, they don't say no, they don't give them tough love, they make them, work through it. I've known hundreds of them where the children fail miserably. I mean, come from good families, they wind up on drugs because the families enable them. But doesn't the government just know that they're destroying the spirit of America? Not America, but any country would do the same thing. Once you give to people and they don't earn it, you destroy the spirit of that person. And that's the most debilitating thing you can do.
I think that's absolutely true. But I think it's part of this wider phenomenon, which is basically that, like, if you think about who are the most admired people in society, and you might think, well, it's soldiers, or maybe it's priests, or I guess not priests anymore, but you might have various answers. But I would say the most admired people in society today, the ones granted the most moral respect, are victims. That suffering has basically become like, proof that you're awesome, or proof that you're morally superior. You can think of it as like suffering is a status symbol today.
Right. Yeah.
And if you've ever, on college campuses, they have now what they call privilege walks, where if you fall into an allegedly privileged category, you take a step forward, and if you fall into an unprivileged one, you take a step back. And so kind of like you hit the moral jackpot if you're a poor black lesbian Muslim. Like, that is just the greatest thing you can be, because you're allegedly the greatest victim in the world. And indeed, it applies even to people who deserve their kind of victim status. So, we're supposed to have sympathy for Islamic terrorists, and we're supposed to have sympathy for criminals. Who are the only people we're not allowed to have sympathy for? Successful people. Yeah. Those are because they're not victims at all, or at least
no, they're victims. Let me tell you
something.
I've been through many companies, and I've struggled. I've created many jobs, and it cost me dearly, and every one of my employees profited by it. But let me stop you right there, only because we have caller. You're on the line. Are they on? No question mark. No. Area code 484, right? 44. Did you want to ask a question or make a comment, caller? Okay, no, they're on the line, but they didn't want. Okay, I'm sorry for interrupting. But I think enabling destroys the spirit, the American spirit. It just upsets me. I've never known anyone who has been enabled. I have friends who are doctors. They spoil their kids. Their kids don't do squat. Talking about inequality, they have a father that's a known heart surgeon, and these kids, they're teenagers and they can't tie their own shoes. And it seems when we give, we destroy that spirit, and it's the worst thing that you can do. And government does the same thing.
I mean, I think there's no question about it, and that's what it's helpful to point to examples of rich children. So precisely, and then it's an example of this is not about poor people are bad and rich people are good. It's that whenever people are able to live on the basis of the unearned, they don't develop, it's very hard to develop the qualities of character that allow you to live a self-directing, self-supporting life. And yet that is the core of what it means to be a human being. It's to be an independent person who guides your own life, makes your own decisions, and shapes your own future. And one of the reasons that I think people don't see this is that there's this real equation of success with money. It's the equation of success with material success. And material success is great, and I think it's important, and but it's not the only or the most important thing. Material success that flows from a career that gives you enjoyment and that you're passionate about, that is a huge boon to your existence, particularly if you learn to spend it well and use your wealth well. But material success is only valuable in that context. If you equate success with material success, then your view is, hey, we can give people success really easily. We'll just hand them a bunch of money. What you can't do them is hand them that feeling of satisfaction and self-esteem that comes from building a genuinely successful career for yourself. But that is really the essence of a happy, flourishing life. I mean, I always just think of my wife. So she's a teacher. And, she's not underpaid for a teacher, but teachers are not particularly overpaid, right? But if you offered her a job at Goldman Sachs, she would refuse. And if you forced her to take it and said, no, you've got to be an investment banker, she would be miserable because success is about much more than how much money you make. The real question is, are you enjoying yourself, and do you make enough to be able to live a self-supporting life? And that is something that you can't give people, but you can make it really, really hard for them to achieve.
When there are riots in inner cities, and I remember the riots in New York back in the someone help me out. The race riots, were they in the late 50s? Late 50s, wasn't it? Late 50s, early 60s? Was that
late 60s?
Yeah. It wasn't the late 60s, I can tell you that, because it was the late 50s or early, anyway. And I actually was escorted to the factory that I was working in by a National Guardsman with a shield and an automatic weapon in the other hand. And I had to run in lockstep with him. So I've been there before. And because I'm a street kid from Harlem. That's why I was born. And I often wonder when you see these riots, especially the ones in Baltimore recently, Baltimore and other places around the United States and Chicago, when people are rioting and they're asking for something, are they not, in a sense, asking for equality, but don't want to work, but they don't know how to get it, and they've been enabled, and they don't want to give anything up that they're getting for free, so they feel trapped, and they don't realize that they're rioting against the very entrapment that they're in. I'm sorry if I'm making myself unclear, but I hope you understand.
No, I definitely get it. I'd say that as with so many pieces of this debate, you get a real blending of things. You get a blending of legitimate grievances, and basically you can think of those as examples of political inequality. To the extent that it's true that police are mistreating blacks, and that's an empirical question that I leave to the side. How much is that happening and so on? But to the extent that that's true, people are right to be upset. And no, it's the government's obligation to protect everybody's equal rights equally. But to the extent that it is, we want the unearned and we want handouts, even if you try to rationalize it and say, well, we really are entitled to it because something happened to our ancestors 200 years ago or 100 years ago, like that is illegitimate. Even if there were those injustices. And I mean, if you talk about, those particular riots, I mean, a lot of it, I think, is not even grievances. I think what you get is a lot of people who, in effect, want to make trouble or want to steal, and so they create riots. And there's a lot of these different things that go into it. And that's why I say the first thing you have to do is just be able to separate out illegitimate and legitimate issues, and then we can talk about, all right, well, what are the right responses to any of these things?
Well, we're almost out of time, but I have to ask, Trump and equality. What are your comments about Trump and equality?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting. If you think about the parallels between the views that he outlined during the campaign and Bernie Sanders, they're actually really similar. So both of them have a view of we live in a zero-sum world. So Bernie Sanders is we live in a zero-sum world, and so the only way to get ahead is that we take a bunch of stuff from the 1% and then we give it to the 99%. In Trump's view of the world, it's zero sum, but it's mostly international zero sum. And so the only way for Americans to get ahead is that we basically we go after the Chinese, we go after the Mexicans, and so on. Right. But that is the wrong way to view the world. That is that we live in a world of producers and of people who, if they were free or freer, could produce. And with producers, then we can all get better off at the same time by being free to create the wealth that our life depends on and trading with others voluntarily, win-win. And the other parallel is that, so you have Bernie Sanders, who is coming out and saying, look, the system is rigged by the rich. And Trump saying, yeah, the system is definitely rigged. And part of what's going on is they point to real problems. People really do feel that there's declining economic prosperity and economic opportunity in this country. And we can quibble about how right they are to claim that, but there is this sense. Right, yeah. But Bernie Sanders attributes it to the rich grabbing all the gains. And Donald Trump's, again, he's focused on it's that China's grabbed all the gains. And both of them point to, it's the guys in D.C., and for Bernie Sanders, they're bad because they're rich, and for Donald Trump, they're bad because I don't know what his view is, that they're clueless, but they're not pro-American enough, i.e. they're not nationalistic enough, i.e. fascistic enough. But what's really going on, in my view, is that there is a sense in which the game is becoming rigged, to use that phrase. But it's not by an economic class, and it's not by one nation or another. It's by what you can think of as the political class. That is, people left and right who want to control other people's choices and wealth. And all they do is differ over how they try to justify that and which groups they want to favor and which groups they want to crush and take a bunch of stuff from. Right. And so what I advocate for is an alternative, which is that you have a ruling class that doesn't want to rule, that wants to liberate, wants to protect the rights of every American, including their rights to trade freely with people across America's borders. And if you do that, that is really the source of our past prosperity, and it will be the source of our future prosperity.
Right. Well, we're just about out of time, Don. I want to thank you so much. I want to give you the last minute to tell our listeners how they may contact you, your website, and especially your book.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I definitely encourage people to get in contact with me. I'm on Twitter at dwatkins3. That's dwatkins, the number 3, and that they can follow my work online at aynrand.org, AYNRAND. But definitely or at equalisunfair.com. So that's the book right here, equalisunfair.com, where we lay out really what it means to value the American dream and how the economic inequality critics are actually campaigning against the American dream.
Yeah. Well, I hope you do accept our invitation to return at a later date, maybe once after Donald Trump is in office, and we can compare the equality quotient of today to where it will be, or where we think it is, after Trump is in office.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, fine, Don. Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you again. Folks, this is the end of today's broadcast. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support, and we'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends, and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. Remember, as my wife would say, you're either allowing your liberties to be taken away or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Stay well. Stay tuned.